сонце більше не зайде, і Україна була, є й буде.
Hello, welcome to Talking Ukraine podcast. Today, my guest is Peter Dickinson, who is British, but you've been based in Ukraine since the 1990s, working primarily in the media landscape, I believe. I've had you on my short list, Peter, of like people to have on this podcast because you're often commenting with various media about what's going on in Ukraine, and you're there now, and you've been living there, for a good chunk of your life and since the war started. So, I'm really interested to get your insights on the latest events. We have a lot of stuff going on with the parade, with this Yulia Mendel scandal, and just in general where we are today. It seems like 2026 is a crucial year in this war. But I'd like to, start with your story. Like, how did you get interested in Ukraine? When did you first get there, and why did you stay?
Well, how did I get interested in Ukraine? I think the honest is I came to Ukraine. I'm a random expat. I think there's two main types of expats that I've run into over the years. There's guys who have a connection to Ukraine, who've always been interested in Ukraine, and very often from the diaspora, not only, but very often from the diaspora. And they've always had that Ukrainian interest, that Ukrainian heritage, and it's always been part of their lives. And then there's the other category, which is what I'm one of, is the sort of random guys who just ended up in Ukraine and became fascinated by the country. So for me, it was I was finishing university in the late 1990s, and I'd applied to the British Foreign Office, the Foreign Ministry, and one of the projects that I was deemed potentially suitable for was in Ukraine. So it was really that simple. I mean, the project itself was very interesting. It looked like an attractive option for me as a young graduate. And so I applied for that, and I was lucky enough to go through the selection process, and I was sent to Lviv. And I arrived with very few ideas of what I was actually going to encounter. I had some some stereotypical ideas about the Soviet Union and Russia. I didn't really have a clear idea of where Ukraine was at that time, or Ukraine's heritage, never mind, the domestic situation in terms of what Lviv represented within Ukraine or anything like that. I mean, literally nothing. I arrived.
What year was this? What year was this?
I was 1997.
Okay, yeah.
So I arrived in late 1997, and I very quickly fell pretty much head over heels in love with the country. I became fascinated by it. It was a lot more Soviet then, or a lot more, a very, very raw post-Soviet for sure. And but Lviv was an incredible sort of magical fairy tale city then, as it is now. And then in some ways it was even more magical then, because it was so completely unknown, and it was much more run down and ramshackle, and it was a much darker place. Just physically darker. I mean, literally the street lights didn't work a lot of the time, and it was, a lot of it, you still have this very strong Soviet legacy everywhere. But it was Lviv. It was this incredibly stunning, architecturally stunning, gorgeous, very, very culturally rich and historically very rich place. And it captivated me. And I just sort of went from there, I think. So, after spending a year with the British Council in Lviv and Kyiv, then I decided to stay on for a period, and that's basically how it all began for me. I never looked back. I moved to Kyiv with the British Embassy, and then got involved in different English language projects over the years, and it's just sort of one thing led to another. It's just continued ever since then. So I've ended up being now in Ukraine for like 28 years. I think it's now 29 years. It will be this year. So a big chunk of my life, and a big chunk of modern Ukraine's history as well, I would say, and all very accidental. But I certainly don't regret a minute of it.
Yeah, I know you primarily, or maybe people, expats in Kyiv know it primarily from What's On. Can you talk a little about what was What's On?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it was a magazine. It was a weekly magazine that was launched in 1999. So it was early days of my time in Ukraine. It was a listings magazine, a city guide of the kind that were fairly routine. around that time, around the time of the millennium and sort of going into the 2000s. And it was very popular. Where it had a period of I would say, if I may say so, I ran it obviously, but there was a period of very, I think, strong popularity. It kind of it caught the mood in Ukraine at that time. I think as the whole country was sort of finding its feet, and the entertainment industry, lifestyle, culture. Was all really sort of taking off, and this was like around the early 2000s, and business was picking up as well. And so we had this run from the first couple of years was very challenging, I would say, from 1999 to around 2000, 2001. But from 2002 onward, it really was a bit of a juggernaut. It was a very profitable publication right through to, I think, probably the late 2000s, when social media started taking off and sort of took over that market, the physical market for print publications, particularly in that niche. But for a period there in the
I would say it was English language. So I remember it was the Kyiv Post and What's On were sort of like the primary English language publications, physical. You can find them. You had articles too. I mean, it wasn't just listings, right? So those were like catering to the English language community.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I mean, a lot of our readers were Ukrainians, though, as well. I mean, it was a very mixed bag, and I used to make a point of always I tried to produce this sort of vision for What's On was very much to be a magazine for Kyiv, not just for the expat community or the foreigners or the diplomats. And we tried to sort of be a bridge, and we had a lot of stuff about what the Ukrainians were talking about, and the personalities who were making a splash, on Ukrainian show business, Ukrainian TV, Ukrainian pop music, all that sort of thing. So it was I think it was a lot of fun for them as well, for a lot of Ukrainians, to see themselves in an English language sort of glossy magazine, which was also at the time a novelty effect. That was a kind of part of the appeal, I think, and the fact that the fact that expats were able to get a sort of inside view of what was actually the local, what locals were talking about, who was in, who was not, who was fashionable, what the new up and coming bands were, or whatever it may be, and also sort of cultural reference points. So it was a lot of fun to do. It was enormously entertaining and very, very very, very useful as well to be running a magazine like that for years. I mean, I ran What's On as the chief editor from 2000. I was originally the deputy editor, and then I ran it as a chief editor from 2001 to 2007. So it's 6 years, every single week, pretty much, apart from a couple of breaks for the Christmas holidays every year and summer. Pretty much every week for 6 years, putting out a whole magazine, covering the whole spectrum from diplomacy and culture and the arts right the way through to casinos and nightlife and so on. It was a whole lot of fun, and it was a really comprehensive sort of introduction or insight into Ukraine in those days.
Yeah. I mean, it seemed like it played an integral part in like that reawakening of Ukraine as a modern country, a modern city, Kyiv as a modern city, shedding its post-Soviet legacy. That it played a part in that. Cool.
Well, it felt like I say, it was something. It was one of those things. It was so much fun to be doing it. At the time you barely noticed. I look back now and. It does feel like a little bit in a way. It feels like almost like it was very like sort of social media. We had the announcements, the events. We had all the photographs from last week's events of what was going on and who was at this event and who was at that event. And it was really, it was almost like a sort of paper version of Facebook in a way, or Twitter or something in some respects. So it was ahead of its time in that respect, and it was certainly part of this whole trend of Ukraine coming out of the shadows and feeling more of a modern European city, I suppose.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And then after that, you moved more into the TV sphere, right? You were involved with Ukraine Today, which was an English language news program, right?
Well, a few different TV channels. Yeah, there was a few TV projects there. There was Ukraine Today, UA TV as well. and also publishing. I'm a publisher now. I publish Business Ukraine magazine from 2009 onwards. I've been publishing that on a monthly basis and now a quarterly basis, going since in the wartime period. We also launched a Lviv magazine for a while. We had a magazine in Lviv that ran from 2008 through to the war, so 14 years. Lviv Today, which was a very interesting project. That was the only regular English language publication outside of Kyiv that ever managed in Ukraine to sort of gain some real momentum. There have been projects here and there over the years in Odessa, in Kharkiv, but Lviv Today was the only one, to my knowledge at least, that managed to sort of get a good run and really establish itself right up until the war itself, unfortunately, of course. So that circumstances have, intervened there. But that was another project that I launched and was, very, very happy to be part of. And Lviv always remained kind of like a first love for me, although I've become very much a Kyiv guy since then over the years. And this is my home. Lviv is always there. It's a very special city, as I think anyone who's been there would agree.
Absolutely. And in the last years, I think it's become even more important since the war started, and a real central point of different people converging and being like a safer hub, because it's just physically further away from what's going on the front lines.
Well, if you look at Ukraine as a whole now, the center of gravity of the country has shifted to the west decisively, in the wartime period. If I go back to the early years of my time here, and even in the 2000s, even till relatively recently, of course, you have Kyiv in the center, which is obviously the main weight, the capital, but it's almost like neutral in terms of geography. It's right in the heart of the country. The wealth of the country, the political power of the country, to a degree, the culture of the country was all in the east. It was all dominant in the east. It was Kharkiv, the Donbass, and so forth, Dnipro. They were the areas that really dominated, and they brought their power to Kyiv as well, I think. And then you had in West Ukraine, of course, Lviv was an important city, but it was really a kind of island in this. The whole west of Ukraine didn't have nearly as much clout on the national scale, on the national level, I think, as the East did. And now that's changed completely. That picture has radically changed. Now you have, obviously, a lot of the East is occupied now. A lot of it is in the combat zone or near to the combat zone. Cities like Kharkiv are frontline cities. They're really they're doing an incredible job, but they're struggling, and obviously they face enormous challenges. Whereas you have a city, they have West Ukraine, Ivano-Frankivsk, Ternopil booming, Uzhhorod booming, Lviv absolutely, booming. Almost, it's increased in population size by perhaps 30 or 40% since the start of the war. Some people believe. I haven't seen exact figures, but I can believe that certainly. And you've got a huge amount of people going there, and that trend is just going to intensify, because businesses are all looking at it now, saying, okay, it's safer in the West. It's closer to the EU. Ukraine's moving towards EU integration. It's a no-brainer. That's where it's all going, and that's where Ukraine's big tandem now is the Kyiv-Lviv tandem, and further east it gets more challenging. So a big shift in Ukraine's center of gravity.
Yeah, and you've stayed in Kyiv. We were chatting before. You said you left with your family, shortly after the invasion started, but then came back in the summer of 2002. Why have you stayed in Kyiv, and how has life been for you and your family, these last years, especially this last winter? This was a tough one.
Well, it's home. In short, it's home. We when the invasion was was looming, and we all knew that something was coming. There was obviously a lot of speculation in early 2022 about exactly what was going to happen. But I think it was pretty self-evident that something big was in the wind. And my position and my family position with my wife. My wife is Ukrainian, and we have 2 children as well. Our position was, well, if it's the full scale invasion, if they come for Kyiv, we'll have to leave. We'll have to move out. I mean, I didn't feel that I would personally be safe. I didn't feel our children would be safe. You know, I've been on the Russian sanctions list for some time. I felt that I would almost certainly be a target. So that was you know, our clear rationale. You know, if we go that way, if it had been a smaller scale operation that some people also anticipate might happen, you know, something in the east, I don't know if we would have left at all. But that was always the way we looked at it. And then the morning of 24th of February 2022, as soon as it became apparent what was happening, you know, then the decision was essentially made for us. Well, we're leaving now. So we left. We moved to West Ukraine, leaving our home and never knowing if we'd see it again. I mean, we left our home, and I think if you'd asked me at the time, although obviously I wasn't dwelling on it at that point, we had a lot of very practical matters to deal with. But I didn't think we'd come back. You know, I felt that there was a good chance that Russia would be able to seize Kyiv. I didn't think they'd be able to hold it. My expectation was that Russia would ultimately fail because the Ukrainian resistance would be too much for them. But I did think that they would have a good chance of at least getting into Kyiv and holding that, or destroying much of the city and much of the surrounding area. So we left our home thinking that we would never come back. You know, we had that very shocking experience of trying to pack our things together, thinking, you know, what do I want for my life? What do I want to save here? And that wasn't an experience I'd wish to repeat. But anyway, we left, and then we went to West Ukraine. We stayed there for a time. Then we ended up crossing into the EU. But as soon as the Battle of Kyiv was won, as soon as it was clear that the Russians had basically been forced to retreat from northern Ukraine, and that the city of Kyiv and the region around here was no longer under threat, I don't think there was any real question for us that we wanted to come back. You know, we knew we wanted to come back. You know, we never thought about settling elsewhere. We were very eager to come back, and we did so in the summer of 2022, and have been here ever since. I mean, for us, it's home. For us, we have extended family here, a lot of friends, the familiarity of the environment, you know, business, cultural connections, you know, just our own family history, the school friends, the children's classmates, and so on and so forth. I mean, it was where we knew we wanted to be here, and you know, it's tough. It's tough at times, and there's no good. I think a lot of people who have made similar decisions to me, or people who might have chosen differently. I think everyone would agree, or everyone would probably tell you that there's no good options now. You know, this is a terrible, terrible thing. It's a wicked, awful, you know, traumatic experience, and there's nothing good to be said about it. But you know, you've got to choose the lesser of evils, or the lesser options, the less damaging options. And so that's really what it's all about for us. You know, I think at the moment, I'd rather that we were here as a family. Who knows? You know, things might change. You know, this, like you mentioned, last winter, yeah, it was a terrible winter. We are lucky. We have a house outside of Kyiv. You know, our situation is not as bad as for many people. People who are living on the 12th floor of an apartment building with no power, no power, no electricity, no heating. They had it much, much worse than we did. You know, where we live, we have our own power source. We've got some backup supplies and so on. You know, we were okay, but it wasn't a feel good time. But for a lot of people, it was much worse. So, I mean, everyone's got to make their own decisions. And I think the thing I would say is it's not straightforward for anyone. You know, people who chose to leave, I can understand that as well. For us personally, for us as a family, this is what makes sense for us. But it's a real personal thing. Everyone's got to make their own calls on this.
Absolutely, yeah. And since the war started, I've seen you, because we're Facebook friends, that you're often offering commentary to some media outlets, various media outlets. And I think you always bring like this sort of Ukrainian/Western perspective. So you don't come across like like gung-ho pro-Ukrainian, but very diplomatically, you sort of weave the line of like, well, here's why you should look at it this way, sort of. And I appreciate it's like this very subtle, I don't even want to say Ukraine, but just like, a perspective from on the ground of the reality on the ground and the feeling from Ukraine. So, I think you're doing an important, job service in presenting that point of view, because there's so much on either extremes, and it's just like this very sort of like coherent and calm. And even though I think I know in your head, I know, you're like a lot more angry probably than you come across,
I mean, sometimes, yeah. I mean, I think. Thank you. First of all, thank you. It's very generous of you. I would say I would call it sort of a Ukraine-centric perspective, because I think what you have here, one of the big issues that you have with media coverage is that you still have this tendency to see everything through the prism of the Cold War or a post-Cold War perspective. It's Russia and it's the West. And Ukrainian points of view can get lost in there, and so that's something I do consciously try to bring through, just to sort of say, well, this is how it looks here. And I think, and I do believe this is what fundamentally, this is what it's all about. If Ukrainians weren't trying to assert their independence, their national identity, weren't trying to decide their own future, none of this would have happened. This is all a reaction to Ukraine's agency. So I try to reflect that and try to sort of bring it back to that when I'm invited to comment by the international media, because I do think it gets lost. You do have this tendency to sort of look at it from the grand heights of sort of geopolitics and apply these very broad views and say sort of Cold War or Russia versus the West, democracy versus authoritarianism, all these sort of things. There's a place for that, and it's there. It is it is part of this. But at its very heart, we have a story of the Ukrainian nation sort of emerging from the Soviet past, coming of age, looking to assert itself as an independent European country, and then everything that flows from that. So that's something I try to sort of take that approach as my baseline whenever I'm giving any sort of commentaries.
It almost feels like there's this sense that Ukraine is not an independent sovereign nation, and it's like a vassal state of Russia, and therefore it doesn't deserve to be, it doesn't deserve the same freedom and rights that other countries in the European Union have, right? It's sort of like, oh, this is part of the Russian Empire. And what you're talking about is, this post-Soviet evolution of Ukraine as an independent state with a new generation, I think, and right.
Yeah, well, that's been the long-term problem. I mean, you've had Ukraine's been viewed through a Russian prism for forever. I mean, like for decades and decades, for so long that when you try to change that, it's noticeable, and it's like, well, we had a situation where Ukraine was covered by Moscow-based correspondents, for example, in the international media, for decades, and that was just seen as the norm, and they would, you would meet guys coming down from Moscow, and you'd meet them in Kyiv, and they might be very decent people and very good journalists and very conscientious and whatnot, but it was almost inevitable that they would bring a certain amount of baggage to their Ukrainian coverage, because they lived in Moscow. They were Russophiles. They'd often, gone through university, even their childhood, being Russophiles, studying Russian history and culture.
Yeah.
Many of them were married to Russians. They socialized with Russians. They worked in a Russian environment. They lived in Moscow, and so on and so forth. And then they were asked to come to Ukraine. Now, obviously, they're going to come to Ukraine with certain stereotypes, either subconsciously or subconsciously embedded. And you'd see it all the time reflected in the coverage that would come out from this, because they would then be putting their Russian narratives into Ukrainian coverage in a way that you'd never get from a journalist if they were asked to report on Poland or on Hungary or on Slovakia or another country. It was almost like they felt that, well, we have to include these Russian narratives in Ukraine because Ukraine is somehow lesser sovereign than other countries, and that was that's been a massive problem. I'm talking about the media aspect of it specifically here, the journalistic aspect. That also applies to a significant degree to politics as well. You talk to people in academia, they sell exactly the same story. There's exactly the same situation in their industry. This incredible sort of Russo-centric, Moscow-centric approach to Ukraine. So this has been going on for a very, very long time, and it's deep. And we're still trying to dig our way out of it. And it may take decades more before we get to the point where people are prepared to look at Ukraine in a much more independent way, in a much more objective way, in the way that they would treat any other independent country. So it's a long road.
Yeah, I think the war and Russia's invasion has accelerated that process. A lot more people, I think, look at Ukraine differently now. 4 years later since the war started. So that's been a side effect. I mean, there've been a lot of I guess side effects, the unintended side effects that maybe have worked for the benefit of Ukraine. Despite all the horrors and that it has experienced, but certainly its army is stronger now than it was, at the beginning of the war, and I think people look at Ukraine, in a different way, as not such a pity case, as it were, back then. But I think I wanted to save this for later, but I think it ties into what you're saying. You wrote an article about the significance of the Orange Revolution, and I also feel that that was a crucial turning point within Ukraine in the way it shapes that identity, and the path that it chose, not becoming another Belarus type. Can you maybe touch on a little why you think the Orange Revolution, from your perspective, was important in Ukraine's post-Soviet history and evolution?
Absolutely. I do think it was a pivotal moment. An absolutely pivotal. I don't think it can't be underlined enough how pivotal that was. And if you look at people talk about post-World War II, pre-World War II, post-World War II as a watershed moment, in a way that people don't talk about pre or post, like the 7 Years' War or something, going back into other history, which is also big wars at the time, but we don't see them as sort of watershed moments in world history or European history. If we look at Ukrainian history, modern Ukrainian history, I would say the Orange Revolution is the moment. It's the big pivotal moment, the watershed when it really changed. Ukraine went into the Orange Revolution as a kind of little Russia, which is an awkward turn of phrase in the current context. But I think to a significant degree that it was. I'd lived in Ukraine for around 6 years at the time, almost 7 years of the Orange Revolution, and there was it's difficult to overestimate how massive Russian influence at that time was. In every sphere, in the politics, business, culture, religion, pop culture. The Russian television not dominated Ukrainian TV channels, Russian newspapers, Russian magazines, pop music, radio stations, books. It sort of had a massive dominance over almost every aspect of Ukrainian life. An actual Ukrainian identity was just somewhere at the very fringes. It was really, really excluded. And I think people probably find that hard to understand now and believe, those who encounter Ukraine today. But that's where it was in 2004. When they were approaching the election that led to the Orange Revolution, and I really didn't think that there was going to be the massive uprising that there was. I was taken very much by surprise by it. I was very pleasantly surprised, I should say, but I did not anticipate it. I was an election observer during the 2004 presidential elections, so I saw firsthand some of the falsification efforts that were going on then. And they were routine then, but it was very, very, it was really over the top. They really pushed the boat out for that. So we had these, bus loads of voters being brought around. That was the thing that you saw most. You saw that all day in both, the first and second rounds of the elections. These buses of sort of these miserable looking people from the Donbass who'd been dragged up to, first round I was in the Kyiv region, the second round we were down in Dnipro. And in both places you saw these bus loads of people being dragged, basically dragged around different polling stations. And there was intimidation, there was open threats. There was ballot stuffing going on. You name it. It was obviously a massive, massive operation. That was organised on a sort of national scale to falsify this election. But we'd seen things similar to that, and that's how things have always been done in Russia. And I think there was a sense that, well, that's just the way it's going to be. But as we know, it wasn't, and there was this massive, massive pushback. You had people. I remember the second round was on the Sunday, and then we came back to Kyiv on the Monday morning, and I was very, very down at the time, and I was absolutely exhausted, and I was very, very depressed about what we'd seen, and the idea that they were going to rig this election, and the idea they were going to put this guy Yanukovych in power, who was seen as he was a thug. He was obviously the Kremlin's guy. He was the Russian guy, but he was also a complete thug. It was a sense of shame as well that this was going to be the guy leading the country. And I remember going down to Maidan that evening, hearing about protests and going down and seeing it and being completely flabbergasted by the scale of the protests. And within 24 hours, by the Tuesday, it was already clear that something very, very big was happening, something historic was happening, something beyond the scope of anything that anyone had anticipated was happening. And it was overwhelming. I mean, it was just incredible. And all of a sudden, by the Wednesday or Thursday, people were openly talking about a revolution. People were openly talking about this in terms of it being a revolution, in terms of the people were prepared to stand. And of course, we look at the Orange Revolution now as a peaceful protest, but at the time, nobody knew that. At the time, people were going there. They were ready to die. A lot of people. That is not just exaggeration. That is the reality at the time. Anyone who was there, they knew that, or they thought the government is more likely than not to use force against the protesters. But they came out in such huge numbers, and there were a lot of pivotal moments. I think the ones that stick in my mind was when the media turned, when the Ukrainian media, which then was more or less similar to Russia today. It was controlled by the government. The people, everyone knew how it worked. Every week they would receive editorial instructions. These are the topics we cover. These are the topics we ignore. These are the people we promote. These are the people we deplatform, and so on. And everything was very, very carefully coordinated and choreographed by the Ukrainian authorities. And then on, I think, day 3 probably of the revolution, the media came out and said, "We're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to lie anymore. We're going to literally rebel against this." And essentially, we're going to acknowledge that we have been lying all this time, and there was when all the people said we're not going to do it anymore, the system kind of broke down on itself. We said, well, who's going to run the news now? Who's going to run the TV stations? And they had to compromise with them to a degree. I think that was that was an absolutely crucial moment. And I think that was, going beyond the actual Orange Revolution itself. So, we know that the election was cancelled. It was rerun. The opposition leader, Yushchenko, won the election. He was appointed president. So there was a political end to the revolution. But I think beyond that, there was the sense that the Ukrainian media had broken out of this post-Soviet censorship bubble. And it's never been put back in. They've never been able to get that genie back into the lamp. They've not been able to do it, despite the efforts of various governments, especially when Yanukovych came back to power in 2010. They've not been able to do that. And so even though the Ukrainian media landscape is got a lot of challenges and issues, it's never become a state-controlled, state-censored environment again. Which is essentially that's the difference between a free and an unfree media. Free media doesn't mean good media. It doesn't mean accurate, objective, professional, thorough, high-quality journalism. It can do, but it doesn't have to. All free media means is the government doesn't control what you can and cannot see, and that's Ukraine since the Orange Revolution. So that was like the key big turning point in terms of what it meant for the country, but also it empowered people because they saw that they'd done this. The government had been very clear: we're stealing the election, we're taking it away from you. The Russians came down, Putin came down before the election and basically told the Ukrainian people, this is how it's going to be. You're with us now. And they put him on every single channel. They interviewed him on every single channel just days before the first round of the vote. And the Ukrainian people said, no, that's outrageous. I remember that was the other big turning point, I think, for me before the elections, when Putin came, and there was a massive negative reaction from people who I'd never heard talk about politics before. People in Ukraine used to be very, very apolitical. You say, I'm not interested in politics. Again, what we hear about Russians today, I'm outside politics. I don't get involved in politics. And when Putin came down for the election, people said, you know what? That's out of line. That's way out of line. And they were angry. They were offended. They were upset, and they wanted to do something about it. And that was another reason why you had this massive protest movement that was so determined to stand up for their rights. So it was a huge moment. It was a huge moment, and it terrified the Russians. It enraged them. I mean, they were incandescent with rage. They were absolutely furious, but it also terrified them. And basically, Putin never got over it, in my opinion. He never ever got over that episode. The Orange Revolution continues to haunt him even now.
And it was such a unique event from the sociological perspective of that. You had Ukrainians coming from all different parts of Ukraine to Kyiv. And it just grew and grew and grew, and it was just like, I mean, it just carried its own momentum at that point. And I think Western Ukraine, brought a lot of these maybe traditional Ukrainian traditions or speaking Ukrainian, some patriotism that you didn't often see in Kyiv at that time. And you had like all these people, sort of discovering this Ukrainian identity that was brought over, and that was also part of this new generation of like, wow, like Ukrainian it's cool. It's the first time it felt like, wow, this is something to be proud of.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think it was also, it was a sense that they did something. They'd achieved this incredible result. They toppled this corrupt regime. They challenged them, and they won. And that was, it was incredibly empowering. It transformed Ukrainian society in ways that I think, that people don't necessarily recognize now. But Ukrainian society as a whole, pre and post Orange Revolution, a very different, very clear dividing line there in terms of engagement with politics. Civil society, we now in civil society now, I think it's taken for granted now that Ukraine has a very, very vibrant civil society. One of the most vibrant in Eastern Europe. Now that didn't just begin with the Orange Revolution, but it was completely turbocharged by the Orange Revolution. After the Orange Revolution, you had an enormous boost in civil society, people getting involved in activism. People were no longer prepared to just accept that the government was corrupt. If some local official somewhere wanted to steal some land or do some particularly dodgy deal, I mean, that still went on. It didn't go away. It hasn't gone away to this day. But if it happened, all of a sudden you had people say, well, I'm going to do something about that. I'm going to challenge this. I'm going to mobilize. And if the courts won't help me, I'll mobilize at grassroots level. And you saw that happening again and again and again. And none of it would have happened, in my opinion, or not nearly on the scale it has happened, without the Orange Revolution. So again, it was a shift in the mindset toward this sort of empowerment and this engagement that Ukrainians now have that is very, very noticeable for its absence in Russia, for example. You see the Russians are so passive. They don't protest about things. They get angry about things. They moan about stuff, but they never actually do anything. And they have, this sense of this apathy and fatalism. That was Ukraine in 2004 before the Orange Revolution. I mean, I see that in Russia today, and it's immediately recognizable as what Ukraine used to be like, 20 years ago, 22 years ago, before the Orange Revolution. And I think that's why that event is so important for Ukraine and so terrifying for the Russians.
Yeah, I mean, I always say there never would have been a 2014 Maidan if the people didn't believe that they could influence events and that they believed in the power of the people, like literally people power could actually make change, and they had that experience of seeing that it could be successful, and so that it gave them, I think, an almost like you're saying, turbocharged it. So okay, this is what we're doing, and we can make a difference, we can make an impact, and it did.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, 2014 was the sequel, no question about it. It was clearly the sequel, and And it wasn't identical, but there was obviously, I mean, they would never have happened without the Orange Revolution, and that there's a very clear line between the two that you can draw, and I think also the Russian reaction in 2014 was more violent, was more hostile, because of the Russians were in a stronger position then to actually intervene, but also B, because I think Putin was so determined that it wasn't going to happen again, that he couldn't face another setback in Ukraine as he'd suffered in 2004. He wasn't going to let that happen again. So he also had learned lessons, and I think he'd understood by then, okay, we got to use force. He tried the political route. He tried to use political corruption to dominate Ukraine. He tried to use economic leverage and economic corruption to dominate Ukraine. Political capture, and none of it had worked. And then he managed to get his guy in as president. And even that hadn't worked. And again, they was getting overthrown by a popular uprising. And I think at that point that this is when Putin really said, you know what? The only route open is a military route, and then it's 2014. Then they went into Crimea, Donbass, and then the road was open to the full scale invasion in 2022. So all of this is linked. All of this is directly linked.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, he underestimated Ukraine like heavily. I didn't think he was that irrational to think that they could like occupy Ukraine, even if they could militarily take some of those cities, but to hold Kyiv, I don't know. It just seemed crazy to try to do, but he thought he could do it. But here we are, 4 years later, and obviously things have not gone according to the way he envisioned.
No, but you've got to understand that from Putin's point of view, he really does believe Ukrainians are Russians. I mean, he doesn't just say that, he believes that. When he says Ukrainians and Russians are one he doesn't mean Russians are Ukrainians. He doesn't mean that Russians and Ukrainians are part of some mysterious third identity. He means Ukrainians are Russians. He says it all the time. We are one people, we're one nation, and so on. He takes ownership of Ukrainians, routinely, and he has done for years, and he genuinely believes that. So he treats Ukraine politically as he would treat Russia. And in Russia, you probably could take over a lot of the country or all the country by simply decapitating the people in power and replacing them with your guys. Russians would go along with that to a significant degree. That might work. Putin is a very, very shrewd operator when he's dealing with the Americans or the Brits or the French or the Japanese or foreign countries that he recognizes as foreign. And he looks at them and he approaches them and he says, okay, let's study them. Let's study their political culture. Let's study their weaknesses. Let's study their desires, their goals, their ambitions, and let's exploit it all and shape up a policy that's going to really get the most out of it for Russia. And he's very good at it. I mean, he's a KGB guy. The KGB were no mugs. They knew how to do this sort of thing. And he manages it very, very well. But when it comes to Ukraine, he says, well, they're Russians. We'll just do what we do in Russia. He pathologically refuses to treat Ukraine as a foreign country. He won't do it. And therefore, his policies to Ukraine are so consistently bad because they're not suitable, because he applies Russian logic and Russian policies to Ukraine, and they fail every time. But he can't admit it, because that would mean admitting that Ukraine is not Russia, which he will not do, which he just cannot bring himself to do. So he's kind of trapped in his own propaganda here, in his own dogmas, because he will not admit that Ukraine is not Russia and that Ukraine is a separate country. Therefore, he will not he will not adopt the sort of shrewd policies that he might otherwise have been able to do if he'd admitted way ago, or even now, but certainly 2022 or before, Ukraine's a foreign country. How are we going to approach it? Rather than just saying, well, they're Russians, and say, we'll do what we do in Russia, and then it's probably going to work.
So, we just had the military parade in Moscow, the May 9th, commemoration of the Great Patriotic War, World War II. It was a lot weaker and toned down than it had been ever, really. Do you think, there was no military hardware, there were less leaders there. It seems like there's a shift in tone in the Russian population. Do you think that something is changing in Putin's perception, or how did this parade, was it like, it was such a public event, usually he's like in denial of creating his own sort of echo chamber or reality. but this was hard to ignore. I mean, do you think this had some impact on the Russian society, the Russian mentality, and Putin specifically?
Yeah, I think it had a big impact. I think it would have had a big impact because I think you hit the nail on the head there. He's very good at constantly projecting strength. Constantly projecting. The Putin's position for the last 4 years has basically been consistently. And then Russia's fortunes have been up and down throughout the war. It's not all been bad. It's not all been good. They've had their moments, but throughout it all, Putin's position has been pretty consistent. Everything's going to plan. We're going to get where we need to be. We're going to achieve our goals. Victory will be ours. Don't worry about anything. It's all under control. And that's been, and obviously he's been sending that message, and he's got his whole team sending that message out. And to a significant degree, I think the Russians have bought into that. They've bought into that. The situation in Russia is not great, but it's not dire. And he's done a very, very good job of insulating the population from the war. So those who are actually dying, Russia's casualty levels are frankly insane, completely catastrophic casualty figures. But who's dying? Well, it's the people from the far-lying regions, the economically depressed regions, and way away from the big population centres. It's ethnic minorities who have very little political capital. It's large numbers of prisoners who, frankly, are completely disposable, more or less, in Russian society. And then, for the last few years, it's large numbers of volunteers who go there of their own free will, who go there knowing there's a good chance they die because they want the money. So there's not a lot of sympathy for any of those categories in Russian society writ large. It's not like in the 1980s when they sent a conscript army to Afghanistan, and far fewer people were killed, but they were conscripts who were sent there, many of them kids. And they were getting butchered in Afghanistan. That did create a big backlash. This is very different. Putin's been very smart about making sure that the people who go there and die are expendable or are not going to cause a big backlash. So overall, I think the Russian people have been very insulated from the war. He's managed to keep his side of the bargain there to a significant degree. But this Victory Day was really damaging for him because that sent a massive signal to the Russians that they will understand that things aren't going well. The Russians are very, very skilled at reading between the lines because they have to be, right? Because their entire information space is dominated by the Kremlin, and it has been, forever, give or take a few years in the 1990s, perhaps. And so they have become, maybe the world's best readers of political messaging and symbolism and gestures to understand what's really going on. And you don't get much of a bigger gesture than Putin downgrading his own parade. You've got to bear in mind that Victory Day is his holiday. It's very personally his day. It's his day when he projects his personal power. When he says Russia is back, we're a superpower, we're a world force, we're one of the great militaries on the planet. We can conquer anyone. It's the biggest holiday of the year, and it's very specifically it's called Victory Day. It could be called Putin Day, frankly. It's certainly Putin's parade. So when he downgraded that and said, this year, no hardware at all, no tanks, no missiles, no artillery, nothing. That was already a massive symbol for the population. And then when he starts basically appealing to Trump, saying, "Can you help get a ceasefire? Can you help persuade the Ukrainians not to attack my parade?" They tried to dress it up, saying, we spoke to the Americans, said we might propose a ceasefire, or we suggest that there should be a ceasefire. Russians understand very well that Putin's asking for Trump's help. They understand that Putin's gone to Trump to say, "Can you speak to the Ukrainians to protect us, protect my parade?" That's incredible. That's an incredible debasement, humiliation for Putin personally, that the Russian public will have recognized, instantaneously. They won't have missed that. They won't have missed that for a second. They all understood Putin is no longer able to protect Moscow, and that's really damaging for him. I mean, I think it's probably the most damaging sort of PR moment of the entire war for him. And that, the international media picked up on that, which was good to see. But I think most of all, the Russian people will have picked up on that, and they were already discontent. There were already a lot of murmurings. The Russians getting upset about their internet being cut off. They're all seeing how the oil refineries and the oil terminals are getting bombed regularly and getting hit. And the situation in Tuapse just in the last few weeks was getting a lot of attention on Russian information space. But the Victory Day parade really hammered it home. It's like the situation is getting out of control, and the old man is no longer in control of the narrative, which is for someone like Putin who depends on this strongman persona is really damaging.
Do you think he might start thinking about exploring an exit strategy, or is he just gonna double down? I mean, like as much as like Ukraine has been damaging, the oil infrastructure and like hitting inside Russia, their oil revenues because of what's happening in Iran have been higher than they have been in years, this last month. So is that going to give him some confidence that he can, like turn this around, economically still? Or I don't know, any thoughts from where you're sitting about that?
Yeah, I mean the Iran thing's been a big boom for him. I mean, I think it's sort of like it's like 50, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. He's losing a lot from the Ukrainian attacks on the energy infrastructure, but he's gaining a lot from the American-Israeli war with Iran. So, it's probably coming out somewhere in the middle between those two different, these negative and positive factors. But he's probably, I mean, I think fundamentally he's just always hoping that something's going to turn up. He's hoping that the Western alliance will crumble. There was huge hope in Russia that when Trump got in, that was it, that Trump would hand them Ukraine on a plate. And Trump tried to hand them Ukraine on a plate.
He tried.
He tried hard. He tried
hard.
hard. I mean, he really tried. He tried hard, and he's still trying now. But I think that, there's a sense that you get more and more over the last, certainly over the last few months, perhaps going back to late last year, there's a sense and there's a realization that Trump can't hand Ukraine over on a plate, that Ukraine does not have to basically go along with whatever America says. Of course, America is extremely important ally for Ukraine. And if Ukraine were to completely lose the support that it still receives from the Americans, it will be very, very damaging. But it's not, America does not hold the fate of Ukraine in its hands. It can't just simply dictate to Ukraine. Ukraine has options here. Ukraine has cards, to use Trump's phrase. And that's been a huge disappointment for Putin. So I think now, now he's hoping that somehow the Europeans can be persuaded to fragment their support or to lose their unity on Ukraine. But the danger there, of course, is that the Europeans are now terrified because they know that Trump's not going to be with them anymore. So the Europeans, the Trump thing actually might in a sense be a negative for Putin now, because Trump has not been able to deliver victory for the Russians in Ukraine, but he has been able to scare the life out of the Europeans by demonstrating to them pretty emphatically that America's not going to protect Europe anymore. So the Europeans have got to defend themselves, and the Europeans are looking at Russia and thinking, how are we going to manage this? Okay, we've got to rearm, but that's going to take time. What are we going to do in the meantime? And they're like, well, Ukraine, isn't it? Basically, Ukraine. Trump has basically made Ukraine indispensable to European security, and so it effectively guaranteed that the Europeans are now going to consolidate around support for Ukraine, and that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing this 90 billion euro package come through. Ukraine signing drone deals with European countries on like a daily basis now. Ukraine is now widely recognized, openly recognized as the key to European security. And so, that's all part of that. That's the Trump factor, and it's not what the Russians wanted to see at all. So, I think that Putin's always hoping that somehow he can chip away at this unity, and like he's always, Putin has a very, very low opinion of the West in general. He thinks the West are completely corrupt, completely venal. They can always be bought off. He's bought off a lot of Western leaders. It's not for nothing that he has these opinions. Gerhard Schroeder went from being Chancellor of Germany to being a Russian employee in a heartbeat. That's the and if the German leader can be bought off like that, I mean, who else can be bought off? The Hungarians have been bought off for more than a decade. That's now changed. That's another setback for the Russians. But fundamentally, I think Putin always hopes that he can break this unity. It won't last forever. And he can just outlast them. So I don't think he's thinking about ending the war now. I don't think he can. I think he's too locked in. If he were to end the war now, he would have a real challenge selling that to the Russian people, because they're going to say, well, look, hold on. So I thought, this was all about reclaiming our Russian lands. But Ukraine still exists, and Ukraine is stronger than ever, and Ukraine is now a hostile state. And Kyiv, the mother city of Russia, is now, the capital of a kind of permanently hostile and very powerful military force on our borders. That's a disaster for the Russians. That's a complete catastrophe, and that's where we are today. So I really don't see how Putin can get away with selling that to anyone, no matter how much he tries to spin it, by demonstrating the glories of the Donbass that he's captured, which is basically just ruins now. So this statement he made the other day, just after Victory Day, that this matter is coming to an end, which was very strange wording. I think that was all about saying to the Russian people, like, yeah, I hear you, I get that you don't like this war, forever. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a sense that I'm also thinking about ending it. I don't think it meant that he's actually close to doing so.
Yeah, I think you're right, because this is his legacy that he wants to leave behind. This is like what it's all come down to for him. So I wanted to touch on this, the sort of wild card that entered today, which is this interview that Carlson did with Zelensky's former press secretary, Yulia Mendel. I haven't watched the full interview, but bits and pieces. She's saying that Zelensky is basically like a horrible person off camera, that he's responsible for money laundering schemes, apparently some drug use, like all this stuff, that there was basically that he somehow changed his position. He wanted to give up Donbass to achieve peace, and then changed his mind. So she left, I guess, in the summer of 2021 from that position of being his press secretary. And now today, she did this interview with Carlson. Do you see like a Russian, I don't know, what is this going to affect anything, either externally, as far as Russian disinformation running with some of these sound bites that are coming out? Is it going to affect internally within Ukraine, and any sense of like, why now? Or is the Russian hand at work here, do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's pure Kremlin messaging. I mean, again, we're not going to be able to. I don't have a smoking gun that Tucker Carlson is getting checks from the Kremlin, but he's been parroting Kremlin positions for years now, and more openly. So I don't think there's any doubt there of where his sympathies lie. Let's put it generously. Let's assume that it's not more sinister than that. But his position on the issue is a matter of public record. Why is this happening now? I mean, it seems like a rather desperate ploy, to be honest. I mean, Yulia Mendel was a sort of controversial figure when she was in her position with Zelensky. She was involved in many different scandals and was not seen as a particularly wise appointment, even back then, when Zelensky's administration as a whole was much less professional, let's say, or well managed than it is now. And she's been out of power since well before the war, since almost a year before the war began. So her insights into what actually has happened since then or is happening now are minimal. But she's been quite prominent on social media for a while with these kind of pro-Kremlin messages, with this kind of pro-Kremlin rhetoric. So I think that the Tucker Carlson, or perhaps if his colleagues in Moscow came and said, "Listen, can you interview this person, because this is where this is the kind of narrative that we'd like to push." And since this interview's come out, we've seen the Russian information machine pick up some of the juicier quotes and really run with them and push them and try and get them out there. That's to be expected. I mean, that's part of it. Again, we don't know the exact mechanics of how this came about, but the rationale behind it is fairly clear. They're trying to use a semi-credible Ukrainian voice to promote Kremlin narratives. Fair enough. I don't think it's going to have a huge amount of impact. I think Tucker Carlson has already gone very, very far away from even the mainstream of MAGA. He's already managed to fall out with Trump himself, it would seem, which is, so he's gone well beyond the mainstream of the Republican Party, then the MAGA, and now he's in this sort of this podcast grey zone, and very much seen as being in bed with the Russians. So I don't think it will have much of an impact outside of the echo chamber which he already inhabits and those around him. It's a very big echo chamber. It's a very big information machine, but I think it's going to be. I think it's it's not going to have any massive impact on the overall narrative.
Yeah.
The political situation in England is I would say quite unstable by British standards. The current government is not popular and is suffering, and it seems to be losing popularity by the day, and losing credibility. So there's a number of we have a traditional two-party system, effectively Conservative and Labour for decades and decades, but there's a number of parties now that are sort of coming through and challenging. We have the Green Party, the Reform Party. So it's a time of quite unusual political turbulence, I suppose you could say, in England at the moment. But one of the few things where I don't see a huge amount of room for big change is Ukraine. I mean, the support for Ukraine is very much locked in across the political spectrum. Certainly, the two major parties are they compete to see who can be more pro-Ukrainian. And those who are these up and coming parties who are trying to break in, they also are trying to calm down concerns that they might somehow not be pro-Ukrainian or be soft on Putin. So, they've made various comments while they were more away from the mainstream, where they didn't think they could get in power, about admiration for Putin from one side. We saw from Nigel Farage, who runs the Reform Party, the Green Party. Their leader has talked about how he would sort of abandon NATO and try and sit down and have a nice cup of tea with Putin and ration, talk it all through. And they've kind of distanced themselves a bit from those positions as they get closer to power, as they start thinking, hold on, I might actually win here. I better start sounding a bit more like a statesman, because they understand that the British public, per se, are horrified by the idea of appeasement of Putin, and stand very much for support, standing with Ukraine and backing Ukraine. So I think Britain is probably one of the most reliable partners that Ukraine has now, long term. I think the Brits will stand with the Ukrainians. And I think another indication of that was how the King Charles, has been prepared to be quite outspoken about his support for Ukraine, because the British monarchy is supposed to be outside of politics. It's supposed to be beyond politics, and that's kind of the fundamental aspect of the British monarchy. The entire system of the English throne, the English crown, is based on the concept that the monarchy is outside of politics, and that's the whole purpose of what it does. It unites the country, it represents the country beyond politics. So anything that the British monarch says that has any sort of political context is by definition controversial, is extremely controversial. And when they're commenting on the biggest war in Europe since World War II, they're taking a very clear position. And King Charles has made no secret of the fact that he stands with Ukraine, he supports Ukraine, he advocates for Ukraine on the international stage. He uses his position to advocate for Ukraine. That tells you, I think, not just about what sort of man the king is, doesn't just speak about his position, his moral clarity, but it also speaks about how sure he is that this won't be a problem with the British public, that they won't turn around and say, hold on a minute, you're not supposed to be talking about these things. You're supposed to be outside of politics. He knows that the British people are so overwhelmingly in support of Ukraine and so horrified by what Putin is doing that he can say these things and get away with them in the way that he could have said the same things about Hitler, for example. It's not controversial. He's so confident about that. He's done it. And you don't see a lot of scandal or outrage about him doing these things. Speaking with Trump especially, I mean, like, we're talking about the King of England going to America and essentially trying to shame Trump or by his, and tell him, you need to support Ukraine, in a way that's so understandable that people in Ukraine were cheering, and people were saying, well done, good for the king. But that's really controversial. Like, exceptionally controversial for the King of England to wade into geopolitics and diplomacy and security and war in such a direct manner. But the reason he does it, again, it speaks volumes about how solid the British support for Ukraine is. So, I mean, I think of all the issues that Ukraine faces now, the British one is one that should give them less cause for concern.
Yeah, well, I guess he sees that there's a need to do it, and with the way the Americans have stepped back, and what's going on with whatever this bromance is with Trump and Putin, that, you know, it needs to be, you know, the truth and what's right needs to be reframed constantly, so people don't get lost in this, in this, I don't know, I don't even know what to call it, what it is. It's just very frustrating for me to understand this dynamic of, you know, like Trump is an apologist for Putin consistently, and the Republicans
Yeah, well,
and the Republicans going along with it. I mean, that's,
well, you know, this is that's, you know, we'll probably never know the true nature of the relationship between Trump and Putin. You know, we'll probably never have a definitive answer of what you know, an explanation for this completely inexplicable behavior of consistently supporting Russia or consistently refusing to criticize Russia, refusing to criticize Putin. You know, it's an exceptionally strange relationship. And I think all we can really say is that, you know, we should not be looking to Donald Trump to back Ukraine or to stand up to Putin. You know, that's the reality. You know, we really, you know, I think that's what we have to say, that we have to draw that conclusion. You know, to delve into the ins and outs of it. You know, why is it, and does he have this you know, is Putin blackmailing him? Is he bribing him? You know, whatever it may be. You know, all of the above might be true. You know, but would it really change anything? I think, you know, I think the bottom line, I think it was Gary Kasparov, or many people, others may have said it as well. You know, it's like, you know, we can debate the nature of the relationship all day, but at the end of the day, you know, the bottom line is, you know, what would he be doing differently if he was a Russian agent? You know, and the answer is not a lot. I mean, he'd probably be doing most of the things he's doing. You know, so we have to draw that conclusion and say, well, you know, whatever it is, we can't rely on him. We shouldn't rely on him. We should do whatever we can to prevent him from being openly supportive of Putin, or more supportive, and we should make plans accordingly, not to be dependent on him in any shape or form. And I think that's exactly what you're seeing now. You know, no one wants to come out and say it in Europe or in Ukraine, for that matter. It doesn't benefit them to do so. But everywhere you look, the pattern is now very, very clear. They're all basically just trying to get on with looking after their own security interests without, you know, minimizing the extent to which they're dependent on Trump, because they don't trust him.
Бо наша воля, то є наша кров, повітря нашої сили джерело, свободи сонце більше не